Good morning. My name is Gabriele Baumann, and I would like to welcome you to our first digital discussion about Europe's next steps on carbon pricing on behalf of the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung. So today's discussion is a joint initiative of KAS headquarters in Berlin and our Stockholm branch for the Nordic countries, which I am representing. As a German Christian Democratic Political Foundation and think tank, are we committed to the process of European integration in cooperation with our partners and friends in the Nordic countries? We want to contribute to the development of sustainable European integration, of sustainable European climate policy solutions. I would therefore like to thank my colleague from Berlin, Martin Schebesta, for bringing up the idea of an expert discussion on EU carbon pricing in the Nordic countries and Germany. We have issued and sent out to all participants a briefing paper on this topic, which is helpful to read for those like me who are not as deeply involved as our experts. To put it easy, we need more coordination and cooperation in Europe to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and meet climate targets. For our second discussion, which will be hopefully later this year, are we planning to elaborate on a recommendation for our political partners? Finland and Sweden are considered to be pioneers on carbon taxing, while Germany has just decided to introduce its own national emissions trading system for those sectors which are not covered yet by the European trading system. I would now like to take the opportunity to welcome our distinguished experts. We have Michael Pahle from Germany, from the Potsdam Institute of Climate Impact Research. He is the head of the working group Climate and Energy Policy. Welcome. We have Fredrik Hannerz from Sweden, from the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency. He is the head of Emission Trading Unit. And Samuli Puroila, expert for climate solutions from the Research Institute SITRA in Finland. And Martin Schebesta, who will be today's moderator. He is political advisor at KAS headquarters for social market economy. And we have right now 25 participants from the Nordic countries and from Germany. And I would like to welcome you as well. And I would also like to point that you have the possibility to later ask questions through the Q&A button. And there's also a possibility, if you like questions from others, you can like them, so they will get priority. Now I would like to give the floor to Martin and further to lead discussion. Thank you. Please, Martin.
Thank you very much, Gabriele, and welcome everybody in my name as well. I'm Martin Schebesta. My colleague Gabriele already introduced me. I'm really happy to be moderating today's discussion. Just a quick sort of update where this will lead, basically. We will now have 3 keynote speeches from our distinguished speakers from about like 10 to 15 minutes each. Then we will have a discussion, and please be free to post your questions in the Q&A function below. I'd now like to give the word to Michael Pahle from Germany. Please, Michael, the floor is yours.
Yeah, many thanks, Martin. Many thanks, KAS, for the invitation, for the opportunity to share my thoughts and my perspective here, and for setting up this digital seminar, which I think is very valuable as a forum for exchange and for further debating the question of ongoing or more intensive cooperation with regard to climate policy in Europe. I hope that I can now successfully share my screen, which so you're probably only seeing the non-presentation mode. Okay, my apologies. I'll try it again. Here it is. So that's a bit of a burden of having two monitors to choose from. So, but now I'm all set. So I'll provide the German perspective, as mentioned. I'm very honored to take the first turn, and looking forward to see the perspectives from Sweden and Finland. I have 4 slides. 2 of them are on the present, 2 of them are on the future, and well, quite naturally, I will start with the present. And it was already mentioned. Let me see if I can move on. My apologies. So, yeah, here I am. So it was already mentioned in the introduction that Germany is not particularly a front runner when it comes to carbon pricing in the non-ETS sectors. And by non-ETS sectors, for all experts, I mean transportation and buildings. And this has changed last year when the government adopted a new climate action program, 2030 specifically, with the aim to achieve the climate targets, the relatively ambitious climate targets in Germany for 2030. And as part of this program, it was decided to implement an emission trading scheme from next year on. And as you can see from the following remarks on how the prices will be and how it will be designed, it's, I would say, quite idiosyncratic. I'm not going to comment on this, but leave that for the discussion. So it will start with a fixed price in next year of 25 euros. Then this price will rise to 30 euros, going on up to 55 euros in 2025. And a fixed price in an emission trading scheme seems to be a weird thing. But the idea is to hand allowances out as much as they are needed for a fixed price. So it's kind of mimicking a tax, actually. In 2026, this will change and allowances will be auctioned, but not the price will not be fully flexible and be dependent on supply and demand. There will be a price corridor, which is rather narrow, in the order of magnitude from 55 to 65 euros. That means the price can fluctuate within this range, and then from 2027 on, there will, and that's the plan, be a free market price, and the price corridor is an optional element in this trading scheme, and this will be decided in the coming years. Actually, it will be decided at the time where the price core has not been implemented, namely in 2024. So just another remark in terms of how idiosyncratic the scheme is. In terms of where it will bring us, there's a contingency plan. If the target will be failed, then there will be the use of the EU effort sharing regulation, meaning making use of the flexibility mechanism to buy emission allowances within the ESR from other member states. And that's important, especially if you have a price corridor, because the price corridor limit puts a price ceiling on the price, and that it strips an ETS of one of its main features, namely to let the price rise to a sufficient level in order to achieve the target. So that's important, but there are good reasons to implement such a price corridor. Maybe we can come back to this in the discussion. And finally, according to the latest assessment of measures in place, it seems rather unlikely, given the setup of the price corridor and the problem I mentioned, that the target for 2030 in the transportation, in the non-ETS sectors will not be achieved. This is particularly holds for transportation, which is particularly wicked to decarbonize, as you probably all know. And it also does not consider the potentially higher EU 2030 targets. And according to rumor, the European Commission has just positioned itself, or will position itself, for ratcheting up to 55%, implying that there would be even more ambitious national targets in these sectors coming through the effort sharing regulation. So that's the situation in the non-ETS sectors. In the ETS sectors, we obviously have a carbon pricing coming from the European emission trading scheme. Nevertheless, these prices not fully delivered in terms of what was expected here in terms of driving decarbonization. So prices were relatively low some years back, and then it was decided to set up a so-called coal commission, which actually has a different name, but it basically was about coal and phasing out coal, which published its recommendations early last year. And then following through with these recommendations, it was decided a mandated phase out of coal capacity until 2038 was decided, following the same regulatory tradition as we already had it with the nuclear phase out. So putting a year tag to every specific plant where it needs to be phased out at latest or closed down. And this bill was just passed into law last month. Interesting with respect to carbon pricing is that the law contains a provision that emission reductions from the coal phase out net of cancellations through the market stability reserve on the European level will be cancelled nationally. And this is in line with the ETS Directive Article 12.4. And it was a very controversial issue because obviously you need to buy, or you have foregone revenues from canceling these allowances, which you would otherwise have sold in an auction. So it's quite a costly measure, but it's necessary to guarantee or to alleviate the waterbed effect that would arise if you wouldn't do so. Given these difficulties, there is also a plan, and this was part of the appendix of this bill, to establish a full cancellation mechanism at the EU level. At the moment, it's foreseen that this will be an expansion or a tweak of the MSR it is, but I think that's still open to debate. But what is sure is the necessity to have some mechanism that cancels additional emission reductions or alleviates, essentially alleviates the waterbed effect. So taking this as a starting point and moving on to what are the plans for the futures, part of this climate action program was also plan or the intent that on the European level, the European emission trading scheme should be expanded to other sectors. That was seen as an absolute necessity, but leaving it open, especially leaving the timeline open a little bit. So that was a plan for the future. And it was already mentioned that this should be accomplished in 2 steps. The first one is to introduce a floor price, a moderate floor price, obviously indicating that there's some controversy about the desirableness of this measure. And the second step was to potentially form a coalition with ambitious and willing member states to get this implemented, leaving open how exactly the steps would look like to get this done. Maybe, well, through making the case at the European level, through building a regional scheme and expanding it up, or whatever. So that's basically open. And importantly, France bought into this strategy, or maybe it was even France who had it in the first place, and Germany bought into France's strategy. In any case, in late May this year, as part of the German-French initiative preceding the EU summit, there was a joint declaration by both countries that emphasized or made clear their support for speeding up the green transition and reaffirming the Green Deal. And as part of it, they mentioned the introduction of a minimum carbon price in the ETS and working towards prospective introduction or expansion of a cross-sectoral European ETS. As I just mentioned it, so it's actually becoming a bilateral strategy already. Finally, and this is more like an input for the discussion and my personal perception of how the debate goes at the moment. There are several options in terms of how to move forward with this question of ETS expansion. So the first one would be what I call an instant expansion. So you would immediately include the transport and building sectors in the ETS as is. And I find it most useful to discuss this in terms of price effects. Basically, it would mean to have this expansion would mean you have a uniform price in all the relevant sectors. And this is what is displayed here in this first panel. In the second panel, there's another option that gains increasing support on popularity among experts, and it's to build up a second ETS. So you would leave the ETS as it is and then implement a parallel ETS for the current non-ETS sectors, leading to an awkward name like the non-ETS ETS, which I found hard to handle. That's why I called it the second ETS. And so given the situation and the decarbonization conditions in these sectors, it's most likely that it will require a higher price. And you already saw from the German situation that plans foresee that higher prices are necessary to make substantial steps towards decarbonization in these sectors. But at the same time, there's a problem. So if you have a carbon price, two carbon prices at the European level, one is very high, one is very low, it will raise the question of economic efficiency. And in order to moderate this discrepancy, this price discrepancy and the problems that come with it, there would be a single gateway between the ETS, the old ETS and the new ETS, allowing to use the old ETS allowances for compliance in the new ETS. It's basically a flexibility mechanism, and depending on the degree, you could eventually also lead it up to uniform carbon pricing if there's completely free flow. If you restrict this flow, you would still moderate or sustain different price levels. And finally, there's a last option, which is actually or probably a non-option, really. So it's electrification. Simply by electrifying transport and buildings, which is the plan, but which might take quite some time, you are moving the cover, increasing the coverage of the ETS as is, and reducing emissions from the other sectors. So it would be more like a wait and see approach, which you could potentially accelerate with additional electrification policies. And what's quite interesting, and I already alluded to it, that I think these are very different. I mean, in terms of design, obviously, but also in terms of how quickly they can be implemented. The instant expansion could be basically implemented tomorrow. I mean, restricting the timelines of the legislatory processes. The second ETS would have clearly a step in between that would only gradually lead up to a uniform price. And the electrification option, as I mentioned, would be more like a wait and see approach. So that's it from my side. And then I think I hand over to who's next, Fredrik? I think. Yes.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thanks for arranging this seminar on the EU ETS. I hope you can hear me by now. I will provide one of the Swedish perspectives. I cannot take responsibility for providing the full Swedish perspective, but some remarks from the Swedish Environment Protection Agency, providing one Swedish perspective on climate legislation and ETS in particular. I will try to start a bit more basic than Michael, and then hopefully come into Michael's points towards the end. But first of all, one very basic thing is that the whole climate legislation, including the ETS and the framework towards 2030, including the targets, was set in 2014. After that, we had a legislative process for several years, setting the details in this framework. That means that the ambitions in this whole package was determined before the Paris meeting and the Paris Treaty. So what we're in right now, and hopefully what we will see coming from the European Commission next year, is proposals to Paris-proof the EU legislation, including the emission trading scheme. And that means from the Swedish perspective that ambitions must be strengthened quite dramatically in the EU legislation as a whole. And we also tend to think that the ETS must be a part of this strengthened ambition. And this is, I guess, an important Swedish perspective that including the support for the ETS, which is our main cost-efficient policy tool in the European Union. And we stand behind it. We have done so since its introduction in 2005. It seems to us that not including a significant strengthening of the ETS as part of the strengthened legislation would be a big missed opportunity. So we clearly stand behind a strengthened ETS as part of the package that we hopefully get next year. Our assessment from the Swedish EPA is roughly that the emission reduction speed in the EU ETS need to double. And that can be done in several ways, by decreasing the overall cap more rapidly, about the double speed, but there are also different ways of tweaking the system to increase the ambition in the EU ETS. So we need to increase the ambition in order to reach EU targets, but we also need to see to that our various member states with higher ambitions, like Sweden, for example, that the policies at EU level supports us in moving forward even more rapidly. And I have to mention the current most hot topic in the Swedish climate debate, which is the construction of an oil refinery on the Swedish west coast, the Preem oil refinery. The refinery is within the EU ETS, and for that reason, it has been judged not possible to pose additional requirements on the refinery from a climate perspective. So in the lower environmental court, it was granted permit, but it's now on the government's table to make a judgment whether it is or should be allowed to construct a new refinery that would become the single largest emission source in Sweden, and that would take up a fairly big chunk of the emission space that would be left by 2045, when Sweden should be have net zero emissions. And the case of the Preem refinery points to the issue of how do we deal with cases where national objectives goes further than EU objectives. That's true for activities within the ETS, but when we then start discussing expanding the ETS, and particularly to transport, this becomes a particular challenge in Sweden. And the reason for that is that we have set ourselves a target of 70% emission reductions from road transport until 2030. It's a strict, ambitious, and, to be honest, very difficult target to reach. And I guess that colors our discussions about moving transport emissions to a shared ETS, but there are also other issues. I'll come to that. But if we start with the issue of the overall target, we have already in Sweden a CO2 tax of about 120 euros per ton, and that's part of a policy mix that contains many other measures. We have emission standards for vehicles, like all other EU countries, but we also have recently introduced what we call a reduction quota system to benefit the most climate friendly biofuels. And we have congestion charges, etc., etc. There is a quite big policy mix in the transport sector, and one question that we pose ourselves is that introducing transport emissions in the ETS, how would that affect the current policy mix? Would it would it actually help us, or would it make it even more difficult over the coming 10 years in trying to address the transport emissions? As Michael said, it's a quite difficult task, and to varying degrees so, in introducing transport in emission trading, and we question ourselves if it's really worth the effort. The other question that comes up in the Swedish discussion is how an introduction of transport emissions in the ETS would affect installations already in the ETS. From our side, it's important to look at the cost for industry that is in the other end of the ETS. We see that while transport emissions, while transport can pass on the cost to consumers, it might be more difficult so for industry to do that. And that leads to the question, how do we deal with industry in the emission trading scheme in the future? Carbon border adjustment may provide a solution, but there could be other solutions as well. And it would be interesting to have a discussion on that issue. It leads to the issue of competitiveness for industry. It would be interesting to hear how you have been discussing that in Germany. We see that shipping emissions is a clear candidate for potentially being included in the ETS, but we see that it's more difficult to introduce road transport emissions in the ETS for the reasons I've just outlined. I think I'll stop there, and then we can come back to these issues in the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael and Fredrik. Last but not least, I'd like to give the floor to Samuli, who's gonna give us the Finnish perspective.
Thank you, Martin. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Martin and Gabriele, for having me here in the panel today. It's an honor to be here and to discuss with Michael and Fredrik about these issues. As Gabriele mentioned, I'm from the Finnish Innovation Fund, SITRA, which is probably not familiar to everyone. So it's an independent think tank working under the Parliament of Finland. And I work for the Climate Solutions team, which aims to analyze actions and solutions to drive more ambitious climate policy. And in that note, we last year published a study regarding the European Union emissions trading system. And I'm going to give you a quick overview of that study, which is does not represent the official stand of the Finnish government or of Finland, but there are many similarities to what has been announced in the government program. But I'm just going to talk you through this study that we did. It was conducted by the German Öko Institute, Verena and Jakob Reichen and San Healy, which were the writers. And the question was, of course, how to align the EU ETS with the Paris Agreement. The aim of the study was to analyze the role of the ETS when EU's climate ambition is aligned with the Paris Agreement. This is what Fredrik mentioned in his opening speech. We know that The current target of 40% by 2030 is not enough. We need to raise it, and there's been discussion about 50 to 55% reduction in the big picture, the EU-wide emissions reduction target. And to achieve that or even higher ambitions, we need to readjust the ETS as well. And the other target of our study was then to provide information about the concrete measures for developing the ETS. So not only is it enough to know how much we need to reduce emissions under the ETS, but we also should have an idea of how we are going to do it. So what was studied in our paper? First of all, it's not clear what an enhanced EU-wide target would mean for the ETS sector. If we're going to enhance our EU-wide target from 40% to either 55 or 60% as set in our study, then it needs to be decided what that means for the ETS sector. How much are we looking to reduce emissions under the emissions trading system? Second, we had a look on what policy measures there are that can deliver this new target. And then not only was the aim to list all the measures there are, but also have a look at how they differ in abatement potential and their political feasibility. And just a quick note here about political feasibility. It does not equal to political will, which of course is needed to achieve any sort of change in the EU, but it means sort of the ease of implementation in this case. So how easy it is to make these changes or apply these new measures. And finally, of course, we drew some conclusions and recommendations based on what was studied. So first, emissions under the ETS need to be reduced by 61 to 65% from the 2005 level, according to our study, if we are to raise the total EU-wide ambition to 55 or 60%. And an important message is that to achieve this, we need a comprehensive policy package. There is no one single solution that can deliver this target. But how to do it was the next question. So now we know that we need a reduction of 61 to 65%, and then the measures that we studied can be divided into 5 categories. First of all, this is again what Fredrik already mentioned in his note. Strengthening the cap is the most important element there is to ensure that the ETS is functioning as it should. That can be done in different ways, but strengthening the cap is one of the main measures. Then there's enhancing the system's resilience to short-term variations. That is what the MSR is doing right now, but there are ideas how to enhance the MSR or add other elements to ensure the resilience of the system. Then there's a carbon price floor that has been discussed widely, and then extended the scope of the ETS, what was already discussed before today, to other sectors like road transport or maritime transport, for example. And finally, there's changing the functioning of the free allocation. So applying a more tiered approach to free allocation of allowances. That's the fifth category. Based on our study, we drew this table of to give an overview of how the measures differ in their efficiency. Here we have all the 5 categories I just mentioned in the previous slide, but they are divided into a bit more specific, or we have all the measures here listed as their own. So we have 12 different measures, and for example, under strengthening the cap, you can divide the measures to applying a higher linear reduction factor. So that's the annual reduction amount of the cap. Then there's rebasing the cap, which means adjusting the cap on 1 year instead of applying a higher linear reduction factor throughout the time horizon. In resilience part, there's MSR with 24% and 36% intake rate. Carbon price floor can be divided to a surrender charge, EU-wide or in some countries or group of countries, but there's also the option of an auction reserve price. And then the extension can be done to maritime transport or road transport and decentralized heating. Those were the measures that we studied. In the paragraphs here, you can see abatement potential, political feasibility, and also the timing of the impact. And there are only 2 measures that tick the box in both high abatement potential and high political feasibility. And those are enhanced market stability reserve with a 36% intake rate, and then applying or the unilateral cancellation by voluntary countries. But other than that, none of the other measures are both high in abatement potential and political feasibility. And there are some measures like the extension to road transport that in our analysis receive a low score in both of the categories, and also that their timing is not fast enough considering what we need to achieve the changes by 2030. And therefore, we concluded in our study that no one measure alone can deliver the change needed or the target required, but we need a comprehensive policy package that consists of 3 different aspects. First of all, we need to strengthen the cap, and this can be done by both rebasing the cap and, in addition, increasing the linear reduction factor. Second, we should enhance the resilience through the market stability reserve. And third, we need a group of countries taking the lead, pioneering the solutions, implementing a carbon price floor or cancelling the maximum amount of allowances under the unilateral cancellation. I'm sure this is something that we will be discussing today. What next? We need to increase the emission reduction target quickly to at least 55 to 60%. We in SITRA believe that it should be over 55%, that has been discussed by the Commission. ETS, the reform should start immediately. We are in a hurry with the reform, and it's going to take some time, so we can't waste any time with that. Member states need to act faster because it's going to take some time in the EU. So we should have Finland, Sweden, Germany take the lead. And it's important to keep in mind that there is no silver bullet but we need a comprehensive policy package to deliver the change. So that's my main message here, or outlining the discussion for today.
Thank you very much, everybody, for these insights. We had three, but I'd say quite different approaches and insights here. I think that there's general agreement that the ETS should be strengthened. But however, I see disagreement on how this could happen. That's one of the takes I've taken from the keynote so far. And another one is also the non-ETS sector. So how should it be expanded and which sector should be included? These are two of the main lines I've discovered here. And I'd like to ask you guys now, thank you very much, what you think should be the first sort of step that should be reformed in the ETS sector, so the already existent EU ETS sector. We've discovered that a stronger cap might be necessary. However, what are your perspectives on the measures? So, Michael, do you think that it's feasible to increase the intake of the MSR, or would you suggest that there's a different line you would take from your perspective?
Yeah, actually, I would like to steer my reply away from the MSR. I've done a lot of research on the MSR, but I think it's quite a technical issue, and we found that when we increase the intake to 36%, there will be oscillations around the intake threshold. And now I'm saying something on the ETSR, this is just a flagging a sort of problem that we found in that analysis. And I can later send around the material if there's interest. But I think that one way or the other, it's doable. If through the MSR or through increasing the linear reduction factor or tightening the cap or rebasing, these are all in general viable options given some technical considerations. But I think the more crucial point is the one that that Fredrik highlighted. So what will happen to the industry? That's a very, very salient, very important pressure point. And I mean, I'm not my mindset is usually not to see barriers to or to draw barriers that there's a feasible price and we cannot go beyond 40 euro per ton because then we would have yellow vest, blah blah blah. I mean, we will need to push the limits in any way to make deep decarbonization happen. I mean, that's probably more or less transparent, but it will be painful one way or the other. But I think the industry aspect is especially relevant, and I see it more or less as a fact that the level of the ETS price will be limited by the degree to which we can shield industry from international competition, but at the same time we should avoid pampering industry. I mean, we probably need a mix of sticks and carrots to make sure that there's room to decarbonize, that we do not kill them instantly, to use harsh words, but at the same time that they are channeling the funds in the right direction. I mean, looking back how it has been in the last years, there has been a considerable allocation of free allowances, and I'm quite confident that all of them went into good things in terms of decarbonization. So I think it's necessary to be stricter on how all these benefits and subsidies are used and to come up with a good plan and a strategy that complements the parallel ratcheting up of the ETS.
Yeah, thank you very much for that reply. So industry competitiveness is also one of the aspects that you, Fredrik, highlighted. Could you maybe go a bit deeper into the considerations that are going on within the Swedish debate about how Swedish industrial competitiveness could be basically held up?
Yes, first of all, I agree very much with what Michael just said, that when it comes to industry, we need a mix of carrots and sticks. Clearly, the CO2 price within the ETS hasn't been high enough historically. Now it's a bit higher. Still, we see that the technology shifts in industry, in order for them to happen, we would need, if it's the CO2 price that should drive the technology shift, then we would need a much higher price. And if we look at CCS, for example, then most likely we would need a price above roughly 100 euros per ton or so, and we're currently at 25. Now, other technology shifts, like in steel industry, in Sweden we talk a lot about fossil-free steel production, since the steel production in Sweden stands for about 10% of all national emissions. It's crucial for us in meeting our climate objectives to find ways towards a fossil-free steel production. Now, that comes with a pretty high cost, of course. And the question is, if we reform the ETS in a way that the price increases dramatically, then will industry still have financing to make the investments needed? Maybe not. But at least at the Swedish EPA, our conclusion is that we will need a policy mix when it comes to industry, and we need to find ways of state and industry cooperation. One example is the Innovation Fund. That's an excellent example of how to steer common funds towards common challenges in industrial development. And we hope that the Innovation Fund will be as, how should I express it? That it will be that will be turned into a tool that actually goes into the right right technology shifts in industry, and it aims at those technology shifts. But it's easy to foresee that a very high carbon cost could make it difficult for base industry to pass on the costs within Europe. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, sorry. Do you have anything else to add, Fredrik?
Yeah, likely later on.
Okay.
Now I'll stop talking.
Thank you. And Samuli, I'd like to know from you, because you've already given quite a detailed sort of outline of your study. Did you also consider the option of like a carbon border adjustment to basically A, avoid carbon leakage, and B, also to retain the industrial competitiveness of Finnish corporations?
Well, no, not in our study. It's the carbon border adjustment is that's a very tricky part of the solution. It's probably something that we need to look into, that we need to protect our industry, but the technical aspects of implementing one is it's going to be very, very difficult. So I'm keen to hear on the other panelists and maybe see what kind of solutions the Commission or proposals the Commission may come up with the carbon border adjustment, but that's going to be a tricky one to solve.
Thanks. Michael and Fredrik, I'll pass on the question to you then. So what do you think about a carbon border adjustment to boost industrial competitiveness, as it's already quite an important topic for the EU Commission? And what would you consider as maybe alternative options to retain industrial competitiveness? Michael, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I can. I mean, it's extremely complex and extremely wicked, I would even say. And we know from the consultation process that the Commission is considering 4 options, so an import tax, an expansion, sort of an expansion of the ETS actually, so integrated into the ETS, and a consumption fee, sort of. This comes in many versions now. I've seen a lot of proposals in the last weeks, probably for good reason, because everyone is aware that this is so crucial. This could be a main barrier, and it's not exactly a new idea. I mean, it has been around for decades, and everyone knows how difficult it is. I mean, for many reasons, for trade reasons, for geopolitical reasons, for administrative reasons. I mean, I could go on with this list, I think, for 5 more minutes. And I think the only viable strategy, unless you want to really make it big, and I think making it big comes with big risks on its own, is to go for the smaller option, to be very focused. And I mean, the Commission already made this clear that it will focus just on selected sectors. And the most straightforward sector to address is cement, and because it can be so easily controlled, and it's kind of really separate. But then this leaves the question, what happens with steel? Fredrik mentioned the steel plant in Sweden, other steel activities going on. And I think in terms of steel, it's more promising to go stronger in the direction of the carrots. And I mean, part of the Green Deal is a strategy to have clean steel plants in 2030. I have not seen much detail for that. But I really think one has to approach this in terms of describing or laying out sequences. So we can only take, I think reasonably, we can only take a first step in border tax adjustments, try that out in one rather simple sector, then wait what will come out of the US elections, what will come out in the negotiations with China. And if we have good experience, then expand it step by step. But this will not be the big immediate solution. So we have to approach this step by step, and likewise, in steel, in aluminium, in the chemical industry, we have we have to focus on the carrots for now, but we have to do it in a way that it's not handing out subsidies again and again. We have to really tie it to incentives, and to agree on some kind of risk sharing between society and industry that is both fair and efficient. And this is, now it comes to, it moves more into visual thinking. So I stop here and leave for Fredrik for more substance.
Well, more substance, I don't know about that, but it's certainly not a yes or no question when it comes to border adjustment measures. It's extremely complex, and Sweden has been very skeptical, I would say, when this idea has popped up over the years. Now it's a bit different. The discussion has come into a new phase, clearly, and we're really looking into the issue of how could such border adjustment measures be designed, in what sectors. Our idea at the Swedish EPA would be to start small rather than big, and try out in some few sectors. We have discussed cement and electricity. We have the issue of electricity imports to EU that could provide for an example to apply border adjustment measures, but it's difficult to be specific because it all connects to other pieces in the ETS legislation, and we're also more leaning towards the idea of it being important to support innovation in industry. And finding ways to do that, like the Innovation Fund and other means of cooperation between states, European level, and companies to support innovation. Currently, the ETS, with its free allocation, and also many member states' compensation to so-called indirect effects, that is the increase of electricity price as a result of the ETS price, is more geared towards production support rather than innovation support. And we're thinking about how to find ways of supporting the innovation and the scaling up of new products and materials rather than supporting the production itself. How we're discussing how to create markets for low carbon products. For example, fossil-free steel. Could that be another mode of working than putting a price at the EU border? So that kind of measures would aim at creating a market within the EU for fossil-free products of different types. So far, we haven't seen that many ideas being floated around of how to practically create such markets. But it would be great to hear any ideas on that topic.
Okay, thank you very much. So I see there's agreement between you that the CBA is tricky and that basically it should be tried in small sectors first and then seen like basically experiment how it works. But I'd now like to move on to another very important question, which also seems to be interesting to our audience, especially the scope or the prospects of expanding the non-ETS sectors. So on that, we've seen that Michael has done a proposal on 3 different options, or let's say 2 options and a non-option. And one of the guys from our audience, Antoine, has posted a question which relates directly to that. And I'd like to extend the question not just to Michael, but also to you, Fredrik and Samuli. Do you think that the setup of a second ETS, given that the whole expansion of the current ETS to all the other non-ETS sectors might be difficult? Do you think this could be a feasible option? But I'd first like to give the word to Michael because the question was addressed directly to him. So if you've seen it in the question and answer format thing, Antoine's question. So Michael, how feasible or credible do you rate the second proposal of yours?
Well, I understand it as a general remark of which level of carbon price is politically acceptable, and I think, I mean, we can only find out. And the case of France is clear, but it's probably not the carbon price itself that's the problem. And I think it's also not static in the sense that it will remain like this forever. I mean, we can observe from the power sector that has been, well, it's relatively advanced in terms of transformation. So they were opposing the carbon price initially very heavily, and now they like it. And so I think we need to think about this in a dynamic way and do not be too concerned about the maximum level, but rather think how can we, over time, lift this price level. And in that regard, what I think is probably much more crucial is do different member states see a second as a solution or as part of the solution to their problems, or do they see it as creating more problems? And this is how I understood Fredrik, and I think that was an extremely important remark. What would have the ETS expansion or a second ETS? Which kind of impact would it have on the existing national policy mix? Would it be supportive or would it be detrimental? And you can also expand this to the EU policy mix. I mean, for instance, transportation standards. What would happen to EU transportation standards when we would have EU carbon pricing in place in the transportation sector? Many people strongly believe that for the time being at least, transportation standards are enormously important in creating leverage for EV adoption. And you could easily imagine a situation when you would have opposition, I mean, politicized, of course, people saying, well, now that we have a carbon price, what do we need transportation standards for? And I think that's an increasingly important and an increasingly challenging condition we could maneuver into. And it's not just the political aspects, it's also just the instrumental aspects, as you mentioned, Fredrik, and as we have seen it in Germany in the case of the coal phase out. So this cannot be taken lightheartedly, and chances are that it would, well, at the very least, I think it needs active, very proactive management of the interactions. And so this is how I think about the options. I mean, every option stands for itself, and it's quite straightforward. But I'd like to find out and think more hardly about which of the options or which of the feature within one of the options would facilitate integration into the national policy mix in the short term, and in the long term facilitate a continuous progression towards having a stronger and stronger carbon pricing system on the European level. So I really think about this in a dynamic way. And I mean, so far I have no clue. I have some intuitions, but I think that's the main task for the months and years ahead, actually.
Thank you very much, Michael. So Samuli and Fredrik, we've heard that you have been basically front runners in Sweden and Finland regarding a carbon tax in the non-ETS sectors. So given that we're talking about the options of expanding the ETS to the non-ETS sectors, from your sort of two national perspectives and the policy mix that comes into play with that, how feasible do you think this expansion of the non-ETS sectors might be for your respective countries? Samuli, would you like to go first on that one?
Sure. Did my picture just freeze? Or is it just me? Can you hear me?
We hear you, but your picture did freeze, yes.
All right. Oh, that has happened a few times before. But let's not let that bother too much. Yeah, considering from Finland's perspective, I don't think, as you mentioned already, we have strong carbon pricing on transport, have had that for a while now already. And the thing is that we don't see that impacting the emission reductions in that sector so much. I think the main obstacles in transport or reducing emissions in transport are not price related. Of course, price plays a role, but there are other issues that have greater impact, like the availability of options and transport comfort or easiness. So applying a higher price for, to carbon on transport sector is probably not it's a solution or part of the solution. We need it, but it's not the only solution that we need. And therefore expanding ETS to road transport sector in Finland, but in the EU as a whole, I don't see that as a very feasible option.
Thank you very much. Fredrik, would you like to comment on that from a Swedish perspective?
Yeah, I mean, the CO2 tax has served us very well in Sweden and I guess in Finland as well. But we have a similar situation in Sweden. It's while it would likely be efficient to increase the CO2 tax in order to tax down the emissions, it's politically very difficult to increase CO2 taxes in the transport sector in the way that would be necessary. So it seems, at least to me, that we more or less have come to the end of the road where CO2 taxation as at least as the main way to curb transport emissions, that would basically need other tools. And now we have a policy mix already, but I would say that the interesting bit with a standalone ETS or an ETS for transport emissions is not the price signal, because that could likely be passed on, but it's the end point, the cap. Introducing the emissions in a system that actually is geared clearly towards zero emissions. That's the important thing with transport in an ETS. It has been, I mean, look at Sweden. We have a carbon tax of 120 euros per ton, but still emissions are not really decreasing because efficiency gains are being weighed out by addition of new vehicles. So the appealing thing would be to have policies that is clearly geared towards zero emissions, and an ETS would make that possible. So that's it would be a very difficult route to take, but there are clearly some benefits.
If I may add here very quickly.
Yeah, sure.
I can absolutely I absolutely endorse this issue. I think it's too much. It's underlooked, and I think in the last 5 to 10 minutes, the discussion tilted towards a little bit towards carbon pricing skepticism. I think one can be skeptical for good reasons, but I think there are some features who are really unique and really important. That only can come in through carbon pricing, and this managing of expectations. I think that's enormously powerful. I mean, even beyond the price, just by the very design of the feature. And just to give another example, I mean, free allocations. We're now having a debate of free allocations just because we know that the cap is final, and we probably wouldn't have this with any kind of standard or whatever that is up for revision in a few years from now or so. That's very far in the future to decide. So that's enormously relevant and impactful. And also we can generate revenues. I think this needs to be considered as part of the equation. So giving out subsidies, having standards, this does not generate any form of revenues. But carbon pricing does. And Fredrik mentioned the ETS Innovation Fund. We can come up with many, many other things in terms of technology policies to support innovation, which I also think is crucial. So we would need to take this from somewhere. And discussing in a policy mix in a world of unlimited funds, it's a no-brainer. But discussing policy mixes in a world of limited funds, that's quite challenging. And this is where the unique strength of carbon pricing plays out, which we should not forget.
Yeah, I just want to make sure here that I don't think carbon pricing is not part of the solution. I absolutely think it does. I just want to be clear that in Finland, for example, there would be no additional advantage to add road transport sector under emissions trading scheme. It would not higher the costs, considering that we already have quite a high carbon tax. And it should be that way, that we should tax carbon in road transport as well. But maybe the fear is that if we start implementing difficult measures, such as including road transport in the EU under ETS, that will take away some of the room that we have for other amendments to the system. And I see that we should focus on resetting the gap and tightening the ETS. And well, you mentioned, Michael, in your keynote that through sector integration and the electrification of road transport, the transport sector is moving under the ETS. It's taking a bit longer time, as you showed in your diagram, that it's in the slow end of the spectrum, but it's still moving towards that. So I'm just thinking that if we need another system to create another system to include transport sector under the ETS is necessary. I probably don't think so.
Thank you very much for your points. I'd like to ask Fredrik and Samuli in particular, since I've just seen that we seem to agree, or you seem to agree, that the ETS is an important measure, but disagree on sort of the prospects. And as we've heard, Germany and France have started an initiative to extend the ETS, and the Commission seems to be going that way too. So my question to Fredrik and Samuli would be whether you would basically be willing to be part of a sort of coalition of the willing that leads the way with the expansion, or given your points, would you rather say that your countries might not be part of that sort of coalition that takes it further?
Well, in Finland, I must say, again, I'm mostly speaking for SITRA's, on SITRA's behalf, but it states in the government program that Finland is keen to dig a bit deeper in the expansion of the emissions trading system towards building specific heating and cooling. So that's something that might be something that Finland would be keen in joining. Again, I'm not sure whether that's a sector that we should expand the system to. Again, the price is not the issue, the main obstacle there, but other issues. But it could be that through that Finland might be interested in exploring the options.
Thank you very much. Fredrik, what about you? Or what is your sort of take on the Swedish national perspective? Do you think it could be an option for Sweden?
Well, I cannot really speak on behalf of Sweden, but I would say, like, we are always, I mean, particularly when it comes to transport emissions, we are fighting to find ways of decreasing the emissions. So it would be difficult to say that we're not open for coalitions that would try to find ways. Now, if the question is, would Sweden join a coalition to move transport emissions into the current EU ETS? Well, that's probably more difficult, but are we open for a collaboration to find ways of increasing CO2 pricing, including possibly through different means of ETS? Yes, why not? We're very eager to find new ways because our transport emissions are not decreasing in the way that they should. It's our main challenge over the coming 10 years in Sweden to get those emissions down. So yes, we are eager to find new corporations.
Thank you very much. And then I'd like to ask you, Michael, from your perspective, what would be the way forward to realize the EU and also the German-French proposals? Like, what is your sort of next steps? So what would be the next steps to realize that from your perspective?
Well, have a trip to Brussels every other week and lobby hard with the Commission, of course. No, I really think, I mean, that's, everything has been on the table. So there is, at the moment, there's quite an uncertainty or quite a need to really figure out what the ETS is meant to achieve for different sectors, for different member states. I mean, even among a group of relatively ambitious member states, we have different functions in mind, let alone the group of member states who are not, I mean, exactly the kind of hard-loving supporters of the ETS. So I really think what's essential at this point is that we create elements of a vision, what we want the ETS to achieve in the short run and in the long run, and how to make this compatible with what we want nationally. That I think is crucial. I also think that the Commission will need to play a coordinating role. I have been for years a supporter of regional initiatives, but I've become increasingly skeptical seeing none of them implemented. And I think the reasons might be quite practical, actually. So you do not have a political container, really, to do those things. And if you do it, it's only on the level of technical standards, maybe, but not in big policy decisions. We might create that, but what we could do is to think ahead jointly. I mean, during events like that, it probably will not spearhead a kind of very new thinking, but it will allow us to see and to align our expectations, and then to formulate a vision, and then to agree on the elements we need to have within the path that make sure that we have this positive interaction with national policy mixes and the incentives to strengthen European policy in the long run. I mean, that's as vague as it can get. I have to apologize for these lofty words, but I think for now it's really about this. This would help enormously. So to be clear about what the ETS is meant to achieve, what is a must-have in the further evolution. And then I personally think that, for instance, the way of having a second ETS, a separate ETS, is doable, but it needs to be designed specifically to achieve or to integrate the necessities or the goals of the more ambitious states. So it should not be, I mean, weaken what's going on in Sweden. I think the one issue one could really stress, and that's a little bit lost when we are recurring to national discussions, is that in the end, we need to transform industry that is not national industry. That's always a European industry. So I think this card needs to be played stronger, saying that we're creating a level playing field and a setting that innovises innovation jointly within the European market. Because, I mean, if you look at any car maker, for instance, what does it matter? I mean, are the domestic markets really relevant? Probably not. I mean, it's usually the global market, and at the very least, it's the European market. So I think we have to, the integrating element could be to think about how to create markets, how to harmonize these markets. And there's this idea at one place in the European Green Deal of creating lead markets. I'm not fully enthusiastic about it, but maybe there's some truth to it and some appeal to it that one could use to further, to align the coalition and to create an element or a political goal that everyone can line up behind. But that's again very vague, and I'm hoping to get clear about this as time goes by.
Thank you very much. I'd like to go back to some new questions from the audience. We have two. One of them is, what is the perspective for a common second ETS, EU-wide, or for a group of frontrunner states with sufficiently high prices for transport from 2026 to 27 onwards? I think we've already sort of touched on that question, but if any of you three would like to answer that or raise some additional points, please feel free. Otherwise, I'd say we'd go on to the second question asked. Do you have any comments on that question?
Maybe a very short one, and please stop me if I'm talking too much. But I mean, again, relating to what Fredrik mentioned about what's the aim nationally. So, if you, for instance, would create a new ETS, I mean, you start from scratch with regard to how to use the revenues from this scheme. And if from the very beginning you make clear that, say, 90% of the revenues or 100% of the revenues goes into the innovation into innovation programs for the regulated sectors. That could be an enabler, I think, for making this happen. So we really have to think it the other way around. You start thinking from the revenues and then go back to the design of the scheme. That would be I think, some approach that is worth exploring.
Thank you very much, Michael. Samuli, sorry we can't see you. Do you have anything to add on that sort of question, or fine by you?
Yeah, sorry, my camera it's not working, so you cannot see me for the rest of the panel. But no, actually nothing to add to that.
Okay, thank you very much. And then I'd like to move on to the second question, with the second new question. Would the integration of importers into the EU ETS in order to put a carbon price on non-EU products as an alternative for tariff solutions favored by the EU Commission be a solution regarding WTO rules? The integration of importers would definitely be a strengthening of the EU ETS right, but then how to guarantee that EU industry is competitive regarding their exports globally? And I think this goes back to the competitiveness issue. Who of you would like to answer on that one?
Well, I could just say that it's a very interesting discussion that we should have on how could we potentially invite new geographical areas or new actors to become members or actors in the EU ETS, expanding the scope geographically in some way. Now we sort of threaten with border carbon adjustments that could definitely be combined with a sort of welcoming instead of those who would like to be inside of the ETS rather than paying border carbon adjustments tariffs. Yeah, that's short comment to that. That's a more sort of it's a more, I would say, possibly a more friendly approach.
Thank you very much. Michael and Samuli, do you have anything to add on that one?
I totally agree with Fredrik. I mean, it would be just words, but it would be a completely different framing. So from threatening or building a fortress Europe towards welcoming and integrating. And I think it offers a lot of opportunity also to build up a reasonable, functionable monitoring, reporting, and verifying system. I mean, eventually we would need this, and all this kind of silver bullets, risky silver bullets on the horizon. So using international offsets, this will never work without a proper MRV system. And this is one very practical way of establishing this, at least in some non-European member states. So I really see a positive appeal. I wasn't aware before, actually. And on the exporting side, I mean, that's enormously tricky. So this is why basically most of the options are focusing on importing and leaving out the exporting. And it also needs to consider the specific trade balance in every sector. But it's still one more on the to-do list that would take another few hours to discuss, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with Michael and Fredrik. Geographical expansion is an appealing option, but how to do it, and especially the export question, they are very tricky, and I fortunately don't have any answers to that.
Thank you very much. So I think what we can take away anyway from this discussion is that there seems to be broad general sort of agreement from the three perspectives we've covered today on the potential of the EU ETS, even though the how is not exactly clear. So which sectors would need to go ahead and be integrated, how or whether we actually would include or open another non-ETS sector as well. Competitiveness, however, seems to be one of the main things we need to consider for the next and further steps. These are my sort of two important takeaways from my perspective. I'd now like to ask our three panelists what their main takeaways from today's session are. And then if there's no further questions from the audience, I'd like to give the word to my colleague Gabriele in Stockholm for a closing remark. If that's okay by everybody. Okay, then I'd like to go around again and like to give the word to Michael first, please.
Yeah, thank you. I really took a lot away from the discussion, and I have to say I was a bit ignorant in that I assumed there was more enthusiasm for ETS expansion in Sweden and Finland, or at least in terms of the views of the people who are informally representing these countries. But I think what the points that were raised, both in the direction of ratcheting up and the problems with industries and expanding it, and the problems of overlap with national policies in place, I was aware of that, but I'm now really confident that they are a centerpiece. They should not be considered at page 55 of a report discussing the design. They should be considered at page 1, so to speak. And this is what I really took away. And I think going along this direction and having a continuous dialogue and understanding the requirements, that's quite essential. And I think it's not only essential for any form of regional cooperation, but I think this will also be essential for the EU level. I mean, they cannot come up with something out of the blue, or they would not want to, I hope, because then the whole proposal would be in vain. And so we need a mapping of this landscape, and then on that basis discuss the ways forward, which is indeed the tricky part. So it's not formulating the endpoint. I think that's a bit of a no-brainer, but how to get there, that's the really challenging part.
Thank you very much, Michael. Fredrik, what are your main takeaways from today's session?
It was an extremely useful session for giving at least me food for thought on developing EU ETS. Extremely useful, I must say. Now I must also add that I'm a very strong supporter of carbon pricing, and if we look back just a few years, the ETS has really shown its benefits. When it comes to the energy sector, we have seen that the carbon price in the ETS has dramatically shifted the behavior of actors in Europe. And so the ETS has shown that it's working. And it has shown that emissions trading is and could be a strong tool for the future as well. The situation was looking pretty different just a few years back. So now that means that pricing is crucial. But my point was also today that it's not enough in some sectors, and transport sector and industry are sectors that is tricky to deal with, and I look forward to further discussions like this. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Samuli, the floor is yours.
Yeah, for the whole of 30 seconds we have left, right? Also, like Fredrik said, I'm also a big supporter of the EU ETS carbon pricing. I believe that's a great tool we have in Europe, and we should continue developing it. What Michael said about even the front runner countries having different views on how to take it forward, that's true. We didn't touch on cancellations or maybe price floor today, which I feel we could have found more of a common ground on those issues the three of us, or the three countries that we sort of represent here. Regarding the expansion, it was interesting to hear the thoughts of Michael and Fredrik. So that's something I take away from here. But I think it's important that we continue developing the system and adjusting it to the reduction targets that we need. EU ETS is a key tool, and we can't waste time in reshaping it.
Thank you very much for your sort of final thoughts and your takeaways. I'd now like to thank everybody again and give the word to my colleague Gabriele in Stockholm. Gabriele, would you like to give a closing remark or your takeaway as well from this session?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Martin, and thank you very much for your excellent moderation. And thank you so much to all speakers for their contribution. So I would just, as I'm not an expert, I also could take away many things for our work here in Stockholm in the Nordics, and it's really good to know that as it was said, that the ETS has shown benefits and that the emission trading system is working. This is what always important to consider. I like the idea of that there has to be more competitiveness, and that it's very important to if we think about the next steps to think more about how to create the market in general. So I would like to stress that we are interested as Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung in Stockholm to continue this discussion and to continue it together with politicians in order to also agree on a certain political standpoint between our three countries. Thank you once again. All the best for you.